Is COVID-19 still a thing? I want to go outside.
Well, you can just stay 6 feet apart from everyone.
Yeah, I've been really confused. They're like, stay 6 feet apart, but then also don't gather in groups of 10 or more. So, like, which one of those overrides? What if we have like 12 people and there's 6 feet in between each of them? Is that a group of 10 or more?
So you're just wondering, like, how big of a grid can we all stand in where we're all 6 feet apart?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel conflicted by these requirements.
We could just bring movie theaters back if only we sit in seats that are 6 feet apart.
Sounds like it.
I wouldn't advise it.
Mm-mm. Are you fatigued enough from COVID yet?
It's not really bothering me. So before this, my wife and I were basically just staying in all the time. And then this happened. And then it was, now you're supposed to stay in all the time. And we were like, okay. We stopped going anywhere at all. Before this, we would run some errands or go out to eat once in a while or something like that. We would also get more delivered food, like prepared right before we got it food. But now it's all like groceries and we do the whole decontamination procedure. But it hasn't really changed a whole lot for me. How about you?
My wife would take kids out to the like the mommies group events that she's involved with in our city. And so she would go like 2 or sometimes 3 days a week to that stuff. And so she really missed that at first. I think she's kind of hardened past it now. COVID has calloused her.
I do sort of wonder how different people are dealing with it. And in our tradition of complaining about journalism, like in every single episode, I feel like the filter through which we see this is just how much does it bother journalists? I don't know. I guess I could read Twitter more, but I don't really have a good way to get a feeling for how does like blue collar rural America feel about it? Or I don't know, how do rich people feel about it? I don't really know there either. I feel like if you're a celebrity, this sucks because you don't have any chances to go get in front of people and especially cameras and be like, hey, remember me? And you can definitely see that with all the celebrities who are doing all these unusual things on YouTube. And they're like, in this time of crisis, let's not forget about me and the things my publicist is having me do. But I don't know how other people feel about this. Feel free to leave a note in the comments, except that all of our listeners are like the same type of people, I think, mostly. It's not a very wide demographic.
Hopefully. That's the only way we can justify 20 views.
We got all of them. We have 100% penetration in a very narrow market.
So I was talking to someone this past week and they were like, apparently we're going to have some antibody testing that's going to be more widespread soon. And we're going to start being able to see what the penetrance of the virus is in the population, because obviously we haven't been able to measure asymptomatic people yet, because we're still at the point where we're only giving tests to people who show symptoms. And so there's still all this uncertainty about what the rate of asymptomatic cases is. And I was talking to this person, and they were like, yeah, I think when we get that testing, we're just going to find that a ton of people have antibodies. They had COVID, they didn't even know it, and they just got better and they have antibodies now. I think they were kind of making an argument towards like, it means we can go back to normal sooner. And I was thinking about it and I was like, well, I think that's right. There will be a lot of people, but I don't think it's enough to really matter. And so I actually went and did some math, and then I redid it just now before I started recording this podcast. But I just looked at Texas, and I was like, how many cases of COVID have they confirmed in Texas? And it's right at 19,000. And so if you say, like, what's a wild guess of asymptomatic rate? Let's say it's 9-1. So 90% of people who get COVID will never show symptoms. So then we can just say, like, there are approximately 10 times as many COVID cases in total as there are ones that we've measured. And this also assumes that, like, we've measured all the symptomatic cases, which is probably wrong. And so what we come up with is that you have about 190,000 real cases in Texas based on that. And then you go and you look, well, what's the population of Texas? Well, it's 29 million. You do the ratio on that, and what you would find is that 0.7% of the people in the state of Texas would have antibodies now. So we can't really use that in support of an argument for like, hey, we can go ahead and reopen quicker because a bunch of people have had the virus and now they have antibodies. It's like essentially the protection in the broader society is still rounding to zero. And so you do have the effects that, like, at some point we can move from mitigation to prevention and tracing and these other methods of controlling a pandemic. That will be effective. But just an argument based on, I think a lot of people have antibodies, isn't supported by the mathematics yet, unless you start assuming like unbelievably high asymptomatic rates, like 1,000 to 1. Then we might be there.
No, even those don't make sense. So I had heard that. I'd heard someone cast the suspicion that, or like, it was like, some models suggest that nearly half the US already got it back in November. And the thing is, like, in some areas of the US, like in New York, COVID is currently the leading cause of death there. And so if it had washed over the US somehow earlier, I don't think people wouldn't have noticed. They would have noticed, hey, suddenly everyone is dying from some kind of cough. And in the same way that they noticed in China, when it first started appearing there, they weren't like, oh, maybe nothing is happening, let's take no notice. Instead, they were like, oh no, there's this very novel problematic thing. This is like another SARS or whatever. The other thing is, often another branch of my family, we've been having nearly this exact same argument that it sounds like you were having. Somebody was like, what if there's a whole bunch of asymptomatic cases? I read a paper where they did some random testing on people, I think in Santa Clara County in California, and they found that it's like 50 to 85x the people were asymptomatic as opposed to symptomatic when they tested them. The thing is that still doesn't change anything about like the spread and the lethality. And some people are thinking like, oh, if only 1 in 50 people even like appears to get it, maybe we can open everything up. And it's like, everything is closed right now because people are dying at an exponential rate. They're not dying because a bunch of people might be getting it or might not. It's because of the deaths. And someone's pointed out that 0.15% of New York City has died due to this. And it's not done yet. That's a lot. It's New York City. And so if you say, oh, well, what if like a whole bunch of people are immune? It's like, this is still really bad. That's still a really bad outcome. You don't want like 0.1% of your cities dying. That's a huge number of people. And it's kind of this weird argument where it's like, people sort of have forgotten that like the deaths are the reason to shut it down. And, what if some other aspect of it isn't as bad as I thought? After you get COVID and the hospital confirms it, then you get a Tootsie Roll Pop from the hospital. And it's like, we could all get Tootsie Roll Pops. 350 million Tootsie Roll Pops sounds pretty good. Maybe we should open it back up. But it's really like the deaths. That's the problem.
I feel like the argument is more from the standpoint of like unjustified optimism that maybe the virus has penetrated through society much more than it really has. And so when we open up, we won't be vulnerable to it again.
Yeah, but okay.
I feel like that's what it's just an argument of hope. Like, hey, maybe things are a lot better than we think.
Yeah, okay.
And then like you run through the mathematics and you're like, people have thrown out like their guesses for what the asymptomatic rate is. And the data I've seen so far are really bad. It's like, oh, we had 130 blood test samples and we measured those. And it's like, I haven't seen good data on it yet.
Yeah.
And so if you just assume something wild, like 1,000 to 1, you still don't get the math to work out high enough to stop people from dying. If you were to just open it up and not move from mitigation to contact tracing and containment and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I feel like that's the other problem. I talk to people and they're like, but when we open up, won't we just go back? Won't it just like jump right back up? And I feel like the government has done a poor job on selling to people that it's a different strategy once you open back up. And I saw it actually pointed out, like explained really well one place last week. And they were like, look, when the first 14 cases of COVID were in the US back in like February, we did contact tracing and isolation. And we were able to like treat those people in the way that you want to treat something like this. And then everything got out of hand. A bunch more cases were coming in from outside the US, and they were already spreading uncontrolled in places that we weren't aware had it, stuff like that. And so then everything got out of hand. And at that point, you can't do contact tracing. You can't do isolation on individual people. You can't manage the situation. You have to go into mitigation. And so then mitigation is just basically, hey, let's try to save as many people as we can while we send everybody home and have them self isolate and shut everything down. But eventually, you're supposed to get to the point where your number of outstanding cases is low enough, your capability has increased enough in terms of medical capacity and supplies that if you do have another flare up, you can handle it. And then you turn to this model of, okay, let's look for a new case. And then when you find one, you're going to go test that person and confirm that it's a real case. And then you're going to talk to them and say, who are all the people who have licked your fingers in the last like 10 days? And then you'll go talk to all those people, see if anyone has symptoms and maybe test them anyway. And you make a web out from there based on the type of contacts they've had with other people. And so then you're able to actually, ideally, you slow it down from spiking out of control again. And then if it does spike out of control in any small area, you can shut down that area. And like, that's what the real plan is. The real plan is not like, we're just going to open back up and go back to coughing in each other's mouths.
Well, some of us are.
I feel like a lot of people don't understand that because you talk to them and they're just like terrified. Like, there's no idea how we're going to handle this when we open things back up. There's someone I know who works for the school district, and they're like, we're trying to figure out what we're going to do when kids go back to school in the fall and they all start getting sick again. And it's like, well, by the time the fall comes, we will have had 4 or 5 months of having some things open to some degree and essentially doing that other strategy, contact tracing, containment, and those things. So by the time kids go back to the school in the fall, like, we ought to be good at that. And then we'll still be doing the other things too. Like, we'll beg our kids not to lick each other's eyeballs and sit 6 feet away. And
yeah,
I don't know how you'll do that in most public schools, but
also like contact tracing doesn't really work with kids. It'd be like, who'd you have contact with? And they'll be like, oh, I don't know. Like, we all took turns licking this same pole, you know? Like,
yeah. And you know, there will be other strategies you can employ specifically to schools. But like, it's just like people don't realize that the plan is not to go back to what we were doing in March.
That's true.
And I feel like the government is doing a poor job of informing people that, hey, like, there is this other way to handle this, and we're almost to the point where we can do it. Where essentially the federal government has said, hey, here are certain criteria, and if your governor wants to, he can like pass these criteria, and then he can go into, you know, opening some certain types of businesses and allowing certain types of things to happen.
Yeah. Although really the governors can just do whatever they want.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll see a bunch of varied reactions, except then they'll all interact with each other across borders. But there's some other questions like, well, when do you open up international travel? And when do international travelers start showing up? And it will be really difficult to deal with that because you could potentially have things like a plane of 200 people shows up and it turns out they all had COVID and you don't know about it until a little later. And then you do contact tracing and you're like, oh no, we have an outbreak that's far beyond our ability to control again through tracing. So I think that's something people wonder about. Also, when like 14 people were in the US confirmed to have it, I would argue that's probably where it was already out of control because people didn't know what the incubation period was. And so this 14 people who had it probably represented a few hundred that were unknown. I guess you can say, oh, well, you know, that's the point of tracing is you go back in time and you follow it. But I think those 200 infect some other people. You figure out from the 14 who the 200 were. But by then they've infected like 8,000 people or whatever.
Yeah. With the strategies that were being employed at that time, it wouldn't be effective. I think in the next several weeks and the coming months, as a couple of states start to ease some restrictions, you have a whole different infection picture because people will probably be wearing masks in public for like the next year. And they'll still be standing apart from each other. And, you know, they won't be meeting in large groups. Theaters won't be open. You know, churches will have to cope somehow. Things like that. And so like the rate of spread will be lower than it was in March when you had those original 14 people.
Although what we're still seeing is R is above 1 in a lot of areas that are under lockdown right now. So there's like a government issued stay-at-home order.
Yeah.
And it's still spreading. Slower, but it's still spreading. And so I agree with you. I think things will forever be different. People wear masks a lot. It'll be seen as more acceptable. Probably let a handshaking will go away, all that. But that's just already happened. And then people are staying home, a lot of them, and it's still spreading. So I guess the idea here is contact tracing combined with slightly lower R value. Definitely not below 1, but slightly lower. But I can make the same argument and say, well, why don't we just do that to the flu? Why haven't we wiped out the flu?
I think the consequences of the flu aren't as bad.
They're pretty bad.
You end up with several strains a year.
Last flu season killed like 34,000 people. We just recently crossed that. It's pretty bad. The flu just kills people all the time. And I think we just might enter into a scenario where COVID just is also the flu. Now we just have two things where we just have the season for them, and then they kill tens of thousands of people, and everyone's just kind of like, whatever.
Yeah, we just adjust to it.
I mean, the 1918 epidemic happened, and I think a lot of us were unaware of it, or, knew of it as a bullet in history. And it killed a lot of people, like a lot. And we're all a lot more concerned with like world wars and things like that, because it was just like, well, it killed them in a really boring way, so who gives a shit? And same thing with flu. When people are worried about causes of death, they're worried about like other people killing them. Like that's a huge concern, but it's really just mundane stuff like the flu getting you.
Mm-hmm. Type 2 diabetes.
Yeah. Like it's hard for people to sustain a level of caring about something like this.
Yeah, I'm trying to square that circle with what you said about the R value is still greater than 1. Yeah. And so like it's still spreading. Active cases are still going up in places. I guess the detail that is like confusing me here is the federal government, at least, is like you need to show 14 days of decreasing cases with level or increasing testing. And so they're saying like do that, and they're basically calling that like the gate. And when you pass the gate, then you go into this phase 1, and I forget what exact restrictions they suggest that you can lift. And then if you pass the gate a second time, you go to phase 2, and then again for phase 3. I guess that's the thing that they're taking into account, that you need to actually have your local R value less than 1.
Well, also, am I saying this or thinking about this wrong? Because like say your R is 1, you'll see your increase in cases just stay the same. So like if you're getting 1,000 cases a day, it'll just be 1,000 cases a day kind of forever. I mean, obviously, it runs out at some point, but that's what an R of 1 means, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can still see your cases be increasing, but the increase can slow down. And I think that is happening in some places. So on the other hand, I think it's still bad in a lot of places. I think it's still above 1 in New York City, for example, but I think it's below 1 in California in general. It's still an epidemic. It's still spreading everywhere. So it's not even close to start reopening things and doing contact tracing type of thing. And I feel like, I don't know if I said this in an earlier episode, but I talked about it for a while. But really the solution for contact tracing is we need Apple and Google to do something, except that they're very terrified of doing anything that's like privacy destroying or totalitarian. And on top of that, we have like Google, who they're a fan of, I guess, you keeping your privacy from everyone but them. And then Apple is a big fan of privacy. And so those two organizations working together isn't necessarily the best mix for that. But tracking everyone's phones is a really good way to do it. But then, we love our freedom. So it's too bad. There needs to be some kind of like opt-in. Like I would opt into sharing information to do tracing. But I feel like contact tracing is going to have this big weak point where it's like there's some guy who doesn't believe in sharing anything or telling anything to anyone, and he goes to church, and then he later gets sick, and then he's like, well, I'm not going to tell them. And then it'll be really hard to deal with having a single skipped node in your graph and then trying to trace everybody after that. And I feel like those people will be the same kind of person. Like the kind of person who's not invested in helping with tracing will also be the kind of person who doesn't care about arresting the spread. And they do something like, oh, I'm kind of sick, but I'm going to go to church anyway. I believe there was a person in South Korea who basically did that. There were like 3 people, they found them, 2 of them didn't spread it very much, but one person like went to a church gathering while they were symptomatic and touched many, many people. And then that sort of triggered the South Korea outbreak. On the other hand, you can imagine South Korea, like, sort of lying about such a story, but it also sounds believable. I think it fits with like the reality of the situation. That is how spreading it works. So it could have happened. And it wouldn't take very many people like that in the US to sort of keep it going. Oh yeah, In actual news, did you see when China came out and adjusted their numbers up 50% for Wuhan, I believe?
Oh, China.
Yeah, so it's exactly what we were talking about. Except I think, like, to the extent that we have a lot of political sway in China, uh, China should be encouraged to do things like that. Like, people shouldn't ridicule them. They should be like, I'm glad that you released your corrected numbers. Good job. Like, we hope to see lots of more correct numbers in the future. And
we hope to see many more corrections to this
yeah,
number.
but you do want to encourage states to tell the truth on these numbers and not shame them for having them be high or for adjusting them. But it does sort of indicate what we had suspected, that China was definitely shading them before. I mean, they gave some kind of excuse, like, oh, we didn't test people who died in their homes, things like that. But I think we know what was probably going on there. Although maybe the US is doing it too. We know the US is doing that where people are untested.
Mm-hmm.
But good job, China. Get a pat on the back from Fungineering Podcast.
Can you feel the corona fatigue setting in?
Well, it's not fatiguing me because this is what I would do anyway. My wife actually pointed out today that I guess some background. If anyone's read Robin Hansen's The Elephant in the Brain, one of the things he talks about, he loves to say X is not about Y. He says a lot of things that are like, that's no clone. But one of them is like, medicine is not about getting better, I believe. And when people decide to purchase medicine, or especially encourage others to do it, a lot of times it's more about signaling your loyalty to that person or signaling that you care. And that's really what's important. And that's why you often see things like the actual efficacy of medicine is not very important in people's consideration as to whether to purchase it. Like you can get those things that are like an overdose of vitamin C, the emergency things or whatever. And people will be like, oh, I take this here, you should take it.
Mm-hmm.
And like, if anything, it's slightly bad for you, but nobody cares. And if you tell them it's slightly bad for you, they're like, oh, well, I'll keep taking it. Because whether the medicine actually works is like far down on their list of concerns about it. And so my wife pointed out that following that through and then thinking about COVID, a lot of people are like, okay, so there's this epidemic. We don't know what to do about it. What should we do? And then everyone's like, well, you should stay far apart. You should wear a mask and you should wear gloves and maybe you should stay at home. And, maybe we should do contact tracing, maybe some travel bans. And everyone's like, all right, we did all those things. Okay, so now let's go back to normal. Because they're like, we signaled that we cared, right? And the signaling is complete. We've all represented to each other that we care about this a lot. Oh, yeah, it's a very serious issue. I take it very seriously, and I really want to send my kids back to school so that they're not here at home with me anymore. And so it's not exactly fatigue, but it's more like people are, they're not prepared to actually do something for like 3 months in a row. Like, what if caring takes the form of 3 months of something negative? And people are like, well, I don't care that much. I didn't want to actually fix the problem. I just want all my neighbors to think that I cared about fixing the problem. They all agree that we all think that we care. Can't we go back to not actually caring if the particular thing works or not? And you see that, like, there's a lot of arguments for why we should reopen. And it's like, well, what about this like exponentially expanding pile of bodies over here? And they're like, well, other than that, I really think we should reopen. So it's like, there's this big part of human nature that's sort of working against us here. It's hard to really be rational about this and be like, and then also like you and I are not in a situation where this hurts us a lot. Like we were not recently unemployed and running out of our savings or something like that. So we can sit here on our ivory microphones and just say what other people should do. And there are other people where it's much harder. And so you tell them, yeah, you're going to have to sit at home for like 3 more months. And they're like, how am I going to do that? Well, you can not pay your rent. And they're like, okay, that helps a little. Also, what am I going to do after that time period's over and rent comes due? But also, I still have to buy food. And it's like, well, here's $1,200, which is not enough.
Good luck.
Yeah. And so, I mean, that's going to be a big pressure factor too.
Here's $1,200, but I live in California or New York. I guess if you live in lovely Tulsa, Oklahoma, that $1,200 goes a long way.
Yeah, much longer. Yeah, I don't think I know anyone here where $1,200 pays half their rent.
Yeah.
Although you can stop paying your rent, but food's more expensive here too. Gas is more expensive. Although maybe you don't need that much gas.
Yeah, I guess until R gets to 1 or less, like your options are kind of limited. I don't know. I'm still just thinking a lot about what you said like 10 or 15 minutes ago about you really can't do anything until then because you're still spreading
Hmm.
at a greater rate.
Maybe you've sort of fallen into the same trap. It's like we're doing all these countermeasures, right? And things are looking better, right? And you're like, all right, so let's start thinking about opening up. And it's like, whoa, we're still really far from that. But your mind sort of jumped to, well, what next? But we're not to next yet.
Are we not though? Because if I look at number of new cases by day, it's been in the same range for like 2 weeks now. It's been in like the 25 to 35,000 new cases per day for 19 days now.
So your argument is R is exactly 1. So let's do some stuff to make it go up.
Well, testing
Like R equals 1 is not a success. That's like your
testing has still been on the rise. So testing has still been increasing. So every day we do more tests, and yet the rate of new infections is still somewhere between 25 and 35,000 a day. Would that not imply that R is right at 1?
It does, yeah. And so that means you're like balanced on the knife edge.
Yeah.
Anything you do is going to push it back into exponential range. So what actions are you advocating for? Like loosening restrictions, going back to a more normal sort of thing, and then hoping contact tracing will do it. Except that we're having, 25,000 cases on a good day? And so I don't think contact tracing is ready to deal with that either.
Okay, here's the difference, though. We're saying that R is 1 for the US
Yes.
on average. Okay, so other places in the US must therefore be at an R of less than 1. Because we don't think places like New York are at 1. New York is still above 1, and New Jersey and Connecticut, and probably Louisiana, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there are places where it's less than 1. And this is probably a population weighted average.
Yeah.
But so there are places where you can loosen things and take those risks, and you'll increase and hopefully not increase above 1.
Okay.
Try and measure and make sure you're not going to hit 1, or you ride at 1.
Okay, I would agree with that.
Yeah, it's just I've been thinking about this for like the last 20 minutes ever since you said that. And I'm like, I feel like there's something here that's wrong. Like, probably I'm making some logical mistakes, and like I have my own biases. Yeah. But like I feel like there's something wrong in that argument, and that's what it is. It's that when I look at the plot of daily new cases for the whole country, it does say implicitly that R is 1 right now with all the countermeasures we're taking, which means there's parts of the country where it is less than 1. And so you can change your behavior and increase R, but at the same time, open some things back up, whatever that
that's
means
true.
to you.
Yeah. Robin Hanson wrote another great thing about that, where he was like, what you really care about is the variance in R. And what makes something really bad is the high R values. So like some people will, super spread. That like they go around and they infect like 20 other people, and they're really the problem. It's not all the people who are a dead end and they don't infect other people, and because like a lot of people are those dead ends,
Right. Okay.
and so what we really care about is like New York City. Like it's awful there, and we want to restrict them from touching anybody else in the rest of the US. But yeah, you make a good point. Like if you're in a rural area and your R is 0.5, or maybe you just don't have any cases, like that's realistic. I think there's probably a lot of places where they just have 0 cases still. Like, yeah, you could be a little bit more open, except what open means matters a lot. Does it include cross-region travel where you go to other regions that have a higher R value? And that's a big problem.
Yeah.
But if it's something like people go back to work and they start going to common areas where they could infect each other, if you're in a place that's doing really well, that's probably okay. So yeah, I mean, you're right. You don't have to treat the whole country as the same thing, since it does divide into political regions, and people are aware of what political region they're in, and those regions can enforce laws.
Okay, I feel much better about all of that now.
It's good that you noticed you were confused.
Yeah, I knew something was wrong there. It's kind of like, to make an aside about Tesla. I would read these comments about the Model 3, and people would be like, I bought a Model 3. It's the best car I've ever owned. And I would read that, and I've probably read that comment 1,000 times on articles about Teslas. Just some random person who bought one is just gushing about how it's the best car they've ever owned. And so like I would read that and I'd be like, God, I know there's something wrong there. There's like some kind of logical fallacy or some error being committed. And I thought about it, and it took me a couple months, and then eventually, like, I came to the conclusion that there were several things wrong. One is, whenever you buy a car, you are at the furthest point forward in your life. You probably have the greatest wealth you've ever had, and cars are as advanced as they have ever been. And so when you buy a new car, it will almost always be the best car you have ever bought.
It's also the newest it'll ever be, even for that particular car. It doesn't have issues yet.
Yeah.
Although Model 3s have a lot of issues when they come from the factory, but still.
But it took me a while to realize that yeah, you're wealthier than you've ever been. The cars are better than they've ever been, and you know it's the furthest point forward in time. And so, like, obviously that's going to be the case. Like, you know, there's a guy somewhere today, or maybe not today because most car dealerships are closed and not selling cars right now, but you know, let's just pretend that there was a guy somewhere today who's buying like the base model Ford Fiesta, you know, and to him that's the best car he's ever owned.
Probably, yeah. I don't even know what you'd want to know from them. Like, project yourself 20 years in the future. Will you still feel like the Tesla was like the best car that you ever bought? And
hopefully not.
They'll be like, well, I thought that about every new car I got. So it's still not exactly helpful, right? It just, I guess it'd reveal the bias.
Yeah.
But you still wouldn't be able to go back in time and update your forum post in a way that added more meaning to it.
Yeah. But it's the same kind of thing as there with the R value on COVID. Like, I heard that and I was just like, I know there's got to be something wrong there.
Oh, yeah.
And it just takes a while to tease that kind of thing out. But like, you can have a pretty good gut feeling that there's some kind of logical problem in this argument.
Yeah, it's one of those more subtle fallacies or biases or whatever, like observational bias or something like that, or availability bias or survivor bias. And it's like hard to notice the part that's missing. Like in the Tesla comment,
yeah,
the key is to like step into the future and then look backwards, but that's really hard to do. And with the R value, it's like it's really hard to reason about not just an exponent, like an exponential process,
right,
but a one that's the sum of exponential processes. Because that's what the US R value is, right? It's the sum of like all the states, or it's the sum of all the regions, or whatever granularity you want to get down to. And then that's very hard to reason about.
Yeah. They not only all have different R's, but then they're also all at different places on their own particular timeline of dealing with this.
Yeah, that's a good point. So like you can imagine something like all the military bases and all the US possessions got it really bad. And so there's like 1 million people that have it. But then the military stepped in and was like, we're either ordering everyone to literally stand 10 feet apart at all times and they just stand there. Or we have the equivalent of martial law, you know, in Guam or whatever, because we can. I don't know if they can, but pretend they can. And so then your like case numbers would look really bad, but then your R would drop off a cliff. But then it still wouldn't mean that the rest of the US was okay. And so it totally skew your numbers. Like to some extent, the US is very dependent on what New York does or doesn't do in terms of the country's numbers. It was a huge power grab by the governor of New York to let his state get that infected. Right. And then he's like, yeah, now I can sway the numbers whichever way I want.
Yeah.
But I think we already made that joke before.
He's unrightfully seized control of a third of the COVID cases in the United States.
Just to get Trump, just to get him. But yeah, that ends up mattering a whole lot in terms of dictating it. Like you said, where they are along the curve. Something I'm really glad about, though, is that I'm not having to hear about the upcoming election yet. And that's really nice. I really don't enjoy hearing about it every 4 years. And this is a lot more interesting.
For 15 months straight every 4 years.
It's so exhausting. And people always want to talk to me about it. They're like, did you see this latest thing that this guy said about this other guy? And it's like,
did he destroy him?
They never destroy them. They're always, it's terrible. It's just so terrible. And then people are like, really, it's like, I'll have these coworkers where I respect their opinions about most things a lot, but they're blinded by their own religious fanaticism around a particular ideology. And in the last campaign, I had people who basically were like, Trump supporters are like the devil. And I was like, do you not see why someone would support Trump? And they're like, no, I don't think there are any legitimate reasons for supporting him. And so, like, how do you have a conversation with this person?
Yeah.
Like, he's like a man who's running for political office in that case. And it's like, he says word. He doesn't like draw pentagrams on the ground and sacrifice babies. And then votes come out of it or something. But they would be like, I would be glad if that's all he did. and like, it was ridiculous. And then these people would want to talk about like, oh, here's the latest thing Trump did. And that was really frustrating. And then similarly, I'd be like, oh, what do you think about these Clinton emails? And they'd be like, oh, well, people make mistakes. And it's like, well, she actually committed a crime. And they're like, eh. And that was weird too, because it was like, I wanted to talk about things like, don't you think it's crappy that Clinton wants to assassinate Edward Snowden for basically mishandling of classified documents? But then when she mishandles classified documents, nobody cares. And they're like, because like it was currently an election year and she was running for election. I feel like people could have thought about it a little bit more if she wasn't running. But that was sort of frustrating. And so it was like, okay, fine, I won't talk to you about this. But then that's like all they wanted to talk about. And so that was really frustrating. Like when I eat lunch with my coworkers, I want to talk about interesting things, not like what religion are you a member of? And that's every 4 years, that's what I'm forced to talk about. And I'm more interested in meta things like, is Trump doing this a good strategy? And then it's like, oh, probably not. Or is Hillary doing that a good strategy? Probably not, and talk about the strategy of the campaign, I guess, but people don't really care. And so instead, we get to just talk about this epidemic, which is new and exciting and has never happened before, or has not happened in our memories. And you can also do things like make predictions about it and then a week later find out if they happened or not. And that's really interesting too, because it's really showing in a really tight feedback loop just how much bullshit is out there, where people are like, oh, I think this will happen, or oh, I think this is the cure, or here's what we need to do. And it's like, nope. Here's a graph.
I think people are sufficiently good at rationalizing being wrong that they're not bothered by that.
That's true.
The worst one I see is people are like, oh, well, 2 months ago, they said it was going to be 2 million deaths. Then they said it was only going to be 100,000. Now they say it's only going to be 60,000. And like, you can't get through to these people that like, this is how a model works. And then like, here's how mitigation strategies work and how like, I hate to say it because I'm so sick of the term, but here's how flattening the curve works.
Yes, I really hate that term.
And so like you're dealing with people who can't understand that stuff. And when they see that these projections have changed, they think it's either a giant conspiracy or it's government incompetence. And it's like, no, actually what we are all doing is being effective and like it's working. Maybe it's not working enough, or maybe it's not working to the degree we'd like or whatever, but it's better than doing nothing, or it's better than what they were projecting we would do previously.
Yeah. It's like, you said this was going to burn down the whole forest, and then we built these fire breaks, and now you're saying it's only going to burn down half the forest. And then we built more fire breaks, and now you're saying it's only going to burn down a fourth of it. Which is it?
Make up your mind.
Because a forest fire is the best example I can think of something that's like near exponential. I think it only has like quadratic growth, but still. Everyone has this intuition of,
right.
Well, once about 100 trees are on fire, probably people can't just go put it out. And it's a lot like that. But I mean, going back to what we said before, the real problem is just governments are not the right thing to solve this. I read something. So it was a blog post by a guy who was linking to Mencia Smallbug or Curtis Yarvin. And they were like, he has this unconventional solution to the problem. And I was like, okay, let's see his unconventional solution. And then I read it and he prefaced it with like, you may disagree with me, but read it and then sit back and take some time to let it sink in and then maybe read it again and see if you agree. And it was basically what should happen is they should create a separate organization that temporarily controls the US and then sets policy to deal with it. And I was like, hey, this is exactly the thing I was advocating for, but we'll never do it. I was like, yeah, I didn't need to take long to let it sink in. Because it's like, yeah, that's the only thing that would work. Probably the optimal response if you're like Trump or something is, okay, I declare martial law. Everything is the same as it was before, except this organization is now in charge. And they can do any action that they think will stop the spread, and they should avoid any other action. That's their charter. I have no idea how you go about appointing someone to be the leader of that, like if you're Trump, because I don't think he knows how to select a good leader of such a thing. I also don't know how you would. Like, who's someone who's a good epidemiologist who's also really politically savvy? I don't know who that person is. But doing something like that would probably be the right way to do it. Also, then later you can put all the blame on them. So, I mean, something like that probably would have been about the perfect response, but like politically, it's never going to happen. And so I thought it was really funny. Although, I don't know, maybe it just seems obvious to me and other people will hear me say it and be like, that's stupid.
Yeah, it seems kind of ridiculous to me.
Do you think it's the wrong answer?
Well, because it can't be implemented. Like there's
Oh,
no
okay.
effective way to actually accomplish it.
Well, no, I just gave the list of steps. Step 1, martial law.
It would also be nice if we would just go ahead and invent time travel and immortality too. I mean, that'd be really nice. But like
You can't outline a series of steps for those, though.
there's problems with implementing that.
I know, but mine has a series of steps that can actually be taken.
Except for all the ones where you yourself say, I don't even know how I would do this.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess I can say how I would do it. It would just take a long time. Like, how do you pick a Supreme Court justice?
You mean
It's not
what's the optimal way, or how is it practically done?
Well, really, either one. But I mean, like, what is the optimal way? You could probably come up with an optimal way. I mean, actually, it's really easy. You list everybody that you're thinking about, and then you sort them by how good you think their decisions will be, and then you ask them in order, right? I mean, that's how I would do it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so how do you pick someone to lead the coronavirus new coalition government or whatever? You sort them by how well you think they'll do, and then you ask them in order. Easy. It's. I mean, I guess you could say, well, how do you sort them? Well,
yeah, you're glossing over the problem with coming up with the criteria for judging them.
yeah, and this is something where I feel like if I were Trump, I would have a bunch of advisors that I could ask. But since I'm just Blake, I can't. I mean, here's what I would do. I would ask my group of advisors that I have in this hypothetical scenario, and I would ask some of them, who do you think are good politically savvy leaders who can like marshal a bunch of people and get things done? And I would ask some other, maybe slightly overlapping group of advisors, who do you think would make really good decisions around epidemiology? And then I would order the candidates based on what these people were telling me, and then I would ask them in order.
Okay. And then you have the small problem afterwards of selling that plan to other people.
Mm-hmm.
And so ultimately, I think coronavirus will cure itself before you can actually work all of this out.
Well, as I've mentioned before, coronavirus doesn't ever actually have to cure itself. Like, what is this cure for the flu? The cure is we just all die from it. Like, some fraction of us die every year. That's our cure.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the U.S. isn't going to stop corona on its own.
Exactly, though, that's the cure. I mean, it gets down to the point where we become apathetic and we don't want this coalition government implemented anymore.
Yeah.
We don't need it.
It sounds like you need to sit down and think for a while about how great my idea is, and then come back, and then you'll see that it's exactly correct.
And if I don't agree, just sit down some more. Think some more.
Just keep sitting.
Sit and think. If you get hungry, remember, you can't get up until you agree.
You'll agree eventually. But also, you'd still have the problem, like I was saying in the middle of that, the U.S. can't stop it on its own.
Yeah.
Like, you could get cases down to 0. You could have 0 new cases, 0 active cases in the U.S., and your borders are like authoritarian levels of closed. And then you remain closed forever. I guess that's a solution. Or you open your borders back up and then you start getting new cases. At some point, you want to dissolve your coronavirus government. You don't want to remain under corona martial law for 100 years or something like that. Like how the U.S. is like, aren't we under like states of emergency all the time? I think we're under like 20 of them or something like that, because they just keep renewing them. I think we're still under whichever one from like 9/11. Like the U.S. just keeps renewing it. So things like that have a tendency to stick around unless they're forced to expire somehow.
Do people need to start mentally preparing for the day that somebody says, hey, there's a second strain of COVID-19 out there? And
I think there's already like 20 strains.
Right. But we think that we're not just going to be able to vaccinate and hit them all. Because I feel like people have kind of hinted around that, like, yeah, maybe this is a thing that will be persistent forever. Like, we won't just have a vaccine. It'll evolve every year just like the flu does. And it'll hang around forever, killing tens of thousands of people a year.
Mm-hmm. On the plus side, what'll happen is it'll kill the old people that it's going to kill. Many of us will get it. And then when you would then be old enough, in 20, 30 years or whatever, to get it and be at risk of dying, you will have already had it several times. And so you'll be resistant to many of the strains that exist. And so then even when you get exposed to it, it's not such a big deal. Like, I don't think very many people get the flu every year. There'll probably be some people who leave a comment and they're like, actually, I get it every year. And
yeah,
I feel bad for you. But like, I don't get it every year. I do take flu shots. I didn't initially though. And I didn't get it every year. Actually, not sure if I've ever actually had the flu. Because everyone's like, oh, you would know, you'd be throwing up or whatever. I've like never gotten that. But you just don't get it every year. And so corona it'll definitely become this like low level background thing. Like, I'm not sure if we measure from like 1918 flu. I don't know if this gets into a lot of unknowns. So is the 1918 flu still around? I've read that it's H1N1.
Yeah, I don't know.
Like that's what it is. I think it's still around. So I think people are still just getting killed by the same thing. So it was really deadly in 1918, and it killed all the people it could easily kill, sort of. It got all the low-hanging fruit, and then it went into the background where it just propagated enough to stay around, and then it could kill the couple of people who show up every year who aren't that immune to it, and they get exposed. And I think COVID might be a lot less deadly. Like, we know it's a lot less deadly than the 1918 epidemic. Like, it's way less bad than that. So if it hangs around in the background in the same way, it could end up being this thing where it's like 500 deaths a year or something are attributable to it. And that means it's basically not worth fighting compared to a lot of other causes of death that exist. So it could be that it becomes a persistent thing. Like, we never get rid of it, but it's so minor. It's like, okay, stop caring about it. Let's all focus on like good flu vaccines and stuff.
Oh man, if it ever gets to that point, then all the people who are like, this was just an overreaction, they'll feel so validated.
Yeah. Luckily, their opinions don't matter very much.
I recall a statistic from Italy that came out several weeks ago, and it was that something like 95% or more of the deaths had at least one comorbidity. And so I guess what you'll see that you were hinting at is that it'll sweep through all of those people in the first several years. And then it'll find year to year new people who have developed those comorbidities. And that'll be who it mostly sweeps through every year, killing. And so on like a long running basis, it'll like sweep out those people and then have a smaller pool of people that it can potentially easily kill any given year.
Yeah, that seems likely. So I guess the lesson here is don't develop comorbidities.
Yes. Actually, it's funny because that's what I've been telling my coworkers. Like for like the last 2 months, I've been like, look, just do all the normal crap you would do to like stay healthy. Like eat right, exercise, get 9 hours of sleep, take your multivitamin, wash your hands. It's just like the normal crap you ought to be doing anyway. The stupid stuff that will keep you healthy, make you live longer, and shorten sicknesses when you do get sick.
But nobody wants to do that.
I know. It's not nearly as fun.
Or they claim that they can't.
Yeah. I've gotten a lot of that. Scoffing when I say get 9 hours of sleep.
Yeah. You're like, do you want to live a long time? They're like, yeah. Do you want to be healthy while you're living a long time? Yeah. Is anything more important to you than that? They might be like, my family, but not really. That's one of the most important things to me. And then you're like, okay, do these things. And they're like, I can't. And usually when you say I can't, what it means is something else is higher priority. Because like everyone has the same amount of time in the day.
Right.
Like when someone's like, oh, I don't have time to exercise. Well, you have the same 24 hours. We all do. You're just prioritizing other things over it. And so people are like, they'll say this is the most important thing to me, but then they don't actually do it.
Yeah.
The reward's just so far off. Sure.
All right, we done.